Good afternoon, and welcome to Stones and Thrones. It's Tuesday, July 14th. My name is Nicholas A. Venna. This is my show. I analyze and talk about current events in society, culture, and political news in pursuit of the good things to which we can hold fast and build upon, stone by stone, until myself and like-minded individuals have thrones that last. Occasionally, I'll be responding to stones that are thrown at me, and sometimes I'll be throwing some stones of my own. Today's topics are following on some of the items we didn't get to in the last couple of shows, and I didn't get to yesterday's show. So I'm going to try to jump right into it and once again recommit to doing a 30-minute show, not a 45-minute to an hour one. My ability to do that remains to be demonstrated, but nevertheless, I will try once again. So, this afternoon's topics. People who want you to disavow what you said, but won't stand up for what you've done. Allegedly, actions speak louder than words. Nick Fuentes and people criticizing the way that he says things, but not the truth about what he says. The woman caught in adultery. When everyone else was gone, who was left? And the manner in which that gives us insights into politics today. Okay, so I want to jump right into these topics. In a brief introduction, we've got this concept of the people who want you to disavow what you've said, but they won't stand up for what you've done. And the reason that this is an important topic right now is because in the last couple of shows, we've talked about these types of things that politicians, lawyers, sociopaths will tend to focus on at any given moment in time, the degree to which the hypocrisy is almost unlimited, and the reality that regardless of whatever any of these politicians or lawyers are saying at any given point in time, it's not actually what they're focused on. It's not actually what they care about. In fact, it's not even something that we could be sure that they care about at all. But what we do know is that they say and do things based off their perception of either what you care about or their perception of what things you would not be able to easily ignore, which enables them to manipulate you, mislead you, and sometimes, when it's the most important thing, simply distract you. And so that sort of begs the question, when there is a rallying cry from any particular corner of the public sphere, any particular corner of public interest, any particular corner of politics or society and the issues that matter to the average person, what's really going on and why is that going on is always the question. And these rallying cries will come together from both sides of the aisle, and they would seem to imply that the issue that they're crying about is the issue that matters to them and that they're focusing on. And the way that they go about it is part of your hint, which is the manner in which they will want you to disavow things that you've said, or they'll want you to disavow the things somebody else has said, but with a complete and total disregard for all of the things that you yourself have done or that this other person might have done. And we saw that with the Plattner resignation and the chorus of voices that rallied together to call for his backing out of the race, withdrawing his candidacy. And we see this type of thing a lot. We've seen it nowhere as much as we saw it with Nick Fuentes, and there's a unique character to that. And so in keeping with the thesis that I put forward, that I understand might be difficult for some people to understand if they've never been introduced to these topics before, there's other people who have seen these things kind of building and snowballing over time, for whom it's not even a question at all. And it's actually perfectly fitting. It makes sense. It helps to complete a picture. And in general, I would say you're the ones that I'm talking to. You're the ones who are my particular focus, and you're the ones who are going to benefit the most from the things that I want to talk about today. But if you'll recall, earlier in this year, 2026, there was a choir of voices calling for the disavow of Nick Fuentes, especially on the right. It was easier on the left. Ironically, there were a couple of moderate left personas that not only didn't receive any calls to disavow Nick Fuentes, but even platformed him when otherwise a disavowal of things that he had said would have just been presumed. And there's certainly questions that could be asked surrounding that phenomenon and the generational run that he had in late 25, early 26, where he really became what in politics can't be denied today is a household name. And the significance of this I discussed in my last show, where I talked about the person Nick Fuentes and the phenomenon Nick Fuentes, and how regardless of what is wrapped up with the person and his opinion about it, or his beliefs or perception of himself, or even level of comfort with things that have been attached to the phenomenon side has somewhat transcended Nick Fuentes as a person. It's not utterly distinct from him, though, and but nevertheless, it has transcended him. What is important is that the core strength of the phenomenon is actually realistically rooted in the person of Nick Fuentes, which is why I took the time to go through the criticisms that are generally sent his way from the right, from religious right, and from Catholics, and that those criticisms were not substantial. They were generally superficial. They would not be sufficient to somehow undermine everything else that he has done, least of all on account of some of the things that he's said, where on the one hand, someone might say, but look how inflammatory the things that he said are, to which I would respond, exactly. And it's precisely because of how overtly inflammatory they are that you can't really take them seriously as actual positions on the issues or actual dispositions in the person. He himself has responded to these criticisms. He's made it clear in more ways than can be counted that he, as a person, and his perception of Gen Z, which he would be also correct, are no longer vulnerable to being shamed the way that they used to, the way that we used to. And it's no longer adequate, let alone a silver bullet, to simply call someone a racist, a sexist, a misogynist, or a Nazi. In fact, from the position that we're at now, as we look at public discourse overall, and we're finally able to talk about the bevy of prejudices and sexist dispositions that are pervasive and widespread in public discourse, in political discourse, even in religious, moral, and ethical discourse, the only real shocker is not how all of a sudden someone would get away with breaking all of the taboos, but how any of these taboos were ever established in the first place. And that ties in directly to the question that I'm raising today, which is, how is it that people come to the decisions to make the disavowals that they make with a complete and total disregard for the things that the person that they're disavowing has done, and most importantly, the fruit of what it is that they've done? And we've seen these examples pop up, especially on the Catholic side of things when it comes to Nick Fuentes with the, he said this sexist thing, he said this misogynist thing, he said this racist thing. And so that should be almost like a de facto and definitive, an inarguable or unarguable flaw, and should justify the dismissal of him and what he's been doing, the movement, his America First philosophy, but most importantly, as a Catholic. And so the disingenuity that comes from that side of the aisle that would attack him in that regard calls to mind a situation that happened with Jesus. And since I brought up this people who have Christ as King in their bio, it was a perfect time to go over one particular story that we've all heard so many times, the woman caught in adultery. And we've all heard it in the context of you can't actually judge anybody. You cannot point out any flaw that any person has or any sin that they publicly commit or acknowledge committing or circumstantially would be almost impossible to deny is taking place. And the idea that you just can't do that because the woman caught in adultery was essentially exonerated by Jesus himself. And the act of committing adultery was essentially a nothing burger. And nothing could be further from the truth. That's not what happened on that day. That's not what is demonstrated in that story. And most relevant to what we're talking about right now and the applications of these types of stories in politics, that was not a moral or an ethical challenge to Jesus by the Pharisees and Sadducees. It was a naked political ploy. No different than what we see today. And so what I'm going to present to you today is the argument that nothing has changed and nothing is new under the sun, but not merely from the perspective that, back in 2,000 years ago, in ancient Rome, and in this religious pocket in Jerusalem with the temple and the conflict between the Jews and the Romans and the revolutionary spirit that was enduring another upswell, the one that would eventually lead roughly a generation after Jesus' death and resurrection to the destruction of the temple. It doesn't just mirror what's going on today. It is exactly the same thing with all of the same religious undertones, the same insincerity and manipulation barely underneath the surface, and that the tricks are the same and the players are not terribly different either. So I want to jump into that right away. But first, I have brought up some notes just to help me get through this more quickly. Because what a lot of people don't really understand is that this conflict was not merely a conflict between the Jews and the Romans. There was actually considerable and significant conflict amongst the Jews themselves. And these conflicts were inter-party, and the differences between the Sadducees and Pharisees is a background that you have to understand in order to see what's happening today. And if you don't understand that background, not only will you not understand what's happening today, you clearly couldn't possibly understand what was happening 2,000 years ago, which all boils down to what exactly is the meaning of the expression Christ is King, and does anybody who uses that expression actually know what it means? But even more, does anybody who uses that expression or puts it in their bio even care what it means? And that's the key, because I'm going to put forth that they don't. They have a perception of how it makes them feel and how it makes them look. And that's what they care about. So let me jump into this. Pharisees and Sadducees. Who are they and what's the main differences between them? Very top level perspective. Okay. These are two groups within the Jewish community in Jerusalem at the time that Jesus is walking, living, breathing, speaking, preaching, teaching, and performing miracles amongst us as the human race, amongst them as the people of that time about 2,000 years ago. So the main differences are the Sadducees are basically the Jewish aristocracy, generationally wealthy, very few in number, and would function almost identical to the way that leftist, progressive political elites would function today. That is, these are very wealthy, very powerful, very admired, aristocratic type figures in family lines who have the power and influence to, in a sense, set the prerogatives of the community, of the culture, and of the church at that time. The Pharisees were slightly greater in number. They were not an aristocratic group of nobles, but were rather what would be the equivalent or similar today anyway to your business owner class, the infrastructure behind the synagogues and the network of synagogues that were, dotted all throughout ancient Rome in all these different regions. And these are the synagogues that Paul would end up going through in the New Testament and establishing Christian churches in these same regions. And Paul himself is a Pharisee. The Sadducees would have been mostly priests. The Pharisees would have been coming from the line of kings. And since I had introduced my thesis, and I think proved it, I don't even want to call it a thesis anymore because really it's just the truth, but I like to say my thesis because then everybody knows it's mine. So, but in reality, it's just simply true. But when you're talking about the, brief reminder, the fact that as Catholics, as believers, all Christians really, but Catholics more than anybody else, we should be looking for a great monarch as prophesied for many centuries in the history of the church, and an angelic pontiff also as prophesied in companion with the great monarch for many centuries. You can see how these same two lines go all the way back even into the threshold of the New Testament times and at the conclusion of the Old Testament in the book of Maccabees, right? So, and the Maccabean revolt that took place at the that's the last book of the Old Testament. You have Judas, his brother Jonathan, and the Maccabean brothers who led that revolt, and they are from the line of kings. And I think it's one of the only places in the Old Testament you will even see the expression of Jews, because it is a particular reference to the monarchical class of Jews, because there's 12 tribes and only one of them is the line of kings, which is Judah, which is the line from which Jesus himself springs. So when you're looking at the Pharisees, you got to understand that this is a group of an economic class, a business class of people who are from the line of kings and in a sense are governing the sort of like the world of Jews and Judaism at the time, because they're in control of the infrastructure or that the message is spread. Right, so the synagogues. But they are a business class, not an aristocracy. Whereas the aristocracy or the sort of aristocratic class of the Sadducees, these are more priests. So most of the Sadducees were priests. Not all priests were Sadducees, but most of the Sadducees would have been priests and a priestly class, but with an aristocratic air to them and generational wealth and influence in their family names. Okay, so these are the two groups. They also have some fundamental disagreements on things, which should not be surprising today. Very briefly, let me just point out that in the same way that the aristocrats and the Sadducees of the times of Jesus would be somewhat analogous to the leftist, liberal, progressive Democrats of the West today in terms of this very small, very rich, very concentrated levers of power and power brokers on the left, and the manner in which they use and leverage and exploit lower classes, the right of that time, and the Pharisees, they're not going to be dissimilar from the Republicans or the GOP of today. And there's a religious proselytism, a spirit of religious proselytism that exists with the right today in the same way that it did with the Pharisees at the time. Okay? So those are some major differences. And when it comes to belief, unsurprisingly, the Sadducees didn't really believe in angels. They did not believe in a resurrection, and they didn't really believe in life after death. So you can imagine the manner in which their culture supports those beliefs. If I'm a member of the aristocracy and I'm sitting on top of society, I am the most important, the most admired, and I have a history of priests, a bloodline of priests and priesthood. In a way, I sort of hold the cultural understanding and approach to the divine, okay? And if there is no afterlife, and there is no resurrection, and there are no purely divine beings like angels, and I am possessing in my bloodline, in my nobility, in my dignity as a priestly class, the essence of these things, well then, I'm God. You follow? That's not different today than what you see in leftism, right? That's why things like transgender ideology come from the left. They're the most likely to play God, okay? So think of the liberal left progressives in a way as like they think they're God, whereas the religious extreme right, they just think they're God's favorite, to the extent that God really doesn't like anybody else but them. So if you're on the left, you are God. And if you are on the right, you're not God, but you are God's favorite. And you are better than everybody else on account of that. These are your two classes, and you can see the way that they mirror kind of what's going on today in politics, if not in the exact specifics, although pretty darn close, generally speaking in the overall picture. The other thing is, so obviously contrary to the Sadducees, on the right, the Pharisees, they do believe in an afterlife. They do believe in the resurrection. They do believe in angels. They believe in supernatural, immaterial, divinely created beings. And that's what you have on the right with the Pharisees. So, but again, remember, they're also your moralizers, okay? The Sadducees, again, unironically, unsurprisingly, they believe only in the first 5 books of the Bible. They only believe in the Torah, okay? They do not ascribe to or follow or pay much attention to or give much consideration and seriousness to the dietary laws, all of the oral traditions that stemmed from the Mosaic Law, or any of the things that the Pharisees added on to it. However, when you look at the Pharisees, not only do they, sort of promote and support and promulgate their oral traditions and consider what we now see as the Old Testament, but what they saw as Scripture, they consider all of it to be significant and all of it to be governing and authoritative, not just the first 5 books. And so naturally, they would find a way to incorporate and assimilate the authority, the power, the admirability, the religiosity, and moralizing self-righteousness that goes along with possessing such a tradition. Okay? So these are kind of your general differences between the two. Paul uses this dispute, by the way, to save his own life when he tells the Pharisees in the book of Acts, I am here because I believe in the resurrection, right? And then all of a sudden the Pharisees and the Sadducees start beating the shit out of each other. So it was a very smart move of St. Paul to do that. Okay, so now let's get to the woman caught in adultery and why this background matters. I'm not going to read straight from it. I don't need to cite it. People should read it. You should be looking at these things and recognizing that we are now more than easily more than 2 generations, arguably 3. Not a difficult argument. Even 4 generations, but well past, like we're over 100 years for sure into a crisis of catechesis. Catholics don't really understand the faith. They don't really understand. Protestants understand even less, almost like annoyingly little. And I'll do a different show on that, but literally one book about this thick, one book about this, no exaggeration, no serious human being could take Protestantism or Protestants seriously based off one book about this thick called Where We Got the Bible, and which is fundamentally a historical argument, not a theological one. And anybody who cannot see that pretty much undermines all of Protestantism, which is built upon this idea of the Bible alone being the source of authority and salvation, it's just not serious. You can't even really take those people seriously. Anybody who raises that argument, they just don't, like, they've been told that, and they've never really questioned it. And that's why those people are very typically, marked with the spirit of the Pharisees, because what they're really attracted to is their own moral supremacy. So, but jumping into that, look at this concept now and open your mind to what is really going on with the woman caught in adultery, and that this is not a story about like, oh, you can't judge anybody. Look, Jesus said, whoever, has no sin cast the first stone, which they all think of as like, oh, if you don't have any sins, you can't actually make any judgments. And that's really just obnoxious and not consistent with anything else that's in the New Testament, let alone anything else that Jesus said, which just leaves the question, what's it actually about? What was actually happening? What did Jesus actually mean? Why did the Pharisees and Sadducees who brought the woman in adultery to Jesus walk away? And a little bit about the extremely mysterious, only once in the entire Bible, circumstance where Jesus himself in the Greek bends and bows down and he begins writing on the ground. So I'm going to read it. This is just straight from the 8th chapter of John. And so it says that it was about morning, daybreak, and the scribes and Pharisees, or the Sadducees, Pharisees, they come up and they dramatically present this woman who was caught in adultery. They throw her on the ground. It says the purpose is to entrap him. And a lot of people misunderstand like the trap. They think like, oh, the trap is, it's because he'd been preaching about mercy. And so that was their trap. It's like, oh, well, if he upholds the Mosaic law, then he's acknowledging that we're right. And if he says don't, to be consistent with his merciful disposition up until this point in time with forgiveness and don't judge and everything else, well, then he undermines what he's been doing. And that's just not what it was. Not even close. So they throw her before him, and they say that she was, caught in this act. Master, this woman was even now taken in adultery. Now, Moses in the law commanded us to stone such a one, but what do you say? So that's the question. And the narrative says, and this they said, tempting him that they might accuse him. But accuse him of what? That's what people misunderstand. Not accusing of, oh, you're not really merciful, or you're not really a good Jew. That's not what they were looking at. That's how people have understood it and been taught for a very long time, and it's just not accurate. It's not even really rational. But Jesus bowing himself down, which in the Greek and the word that's being used there actually implies almost like embarrassment. Says he's obviously not embarrassed of himself because he does confound them again. Here, he's already done it more than once. He eventually does it so violently in terms of the humiliation that he exposes them to with the tax question, also purely political. They don't ever test him again at some point. So they do take violent, intellectual, public, humiliation, beatings from Jesus in these situations, and this is just one of them. So him bowing down in almost a signaling of like embarrassment is best understood as like embarrassment because of his identification with the sinners and this woman. So he's sort of like embarrassed for the manner in which like he is lobbying on their behalf and taking the fight to the ruling class who views them as less than. And that's embarrassing. But more importantly, on a mystical level, it's clear that as God, he is actually participating in her actual experience of humiliation and embarrassment in that very moment. Jesus then says to them, while he's writing on the ground, and he doesn't say anything yet. He just stays there. They perceive this, and so it goes on. When, therefore, they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said to them. So pay attention to the language. He is expressing embarrassment, and he doesn't answer them when they're like, oh, she was just right now, in this very moment, caught in the act of adultery. Here she is right in front of you. Law of Moses says we should stone her. What do you think? And then he bows down, embarrassed, participating in her humiliation. And then they continue to press him, even though they perceive this, and they go on. And this time it says he lifted himself up, right? So first he participates in the personal experience of the woman, then lifting himself up, okay? Here's why this matters, and here's why this is inseparable from politics of today, because it's always been politics. When politicians come to the public and then they make a big show and a big display of, oh, look at this, senatorial candidate was, caught in the act of adultery or whatever else. So now we're roundly calling for him to bow out from the race on the eve of when he's the front runner. They don't actually care about the persons involved at all. They don't care about the person. They don't care about the conduct of the senator. They don't care about the woman who, in this case, was allegedly the victim, clearly not a victim. They don't care about any of that. For them, it's always just politics. They care about politics. They care about power. They care about influence. And they need the movement of the people, the sentiment of the people to sustain and carry them on their shoulders in order to maintain this power. And they use the personal and the subjective as chum. They just throw this chum in the water for the fish, which is us, to all start, flopping all over ourselves for it. Because we do actually care about people, at least we should, and about these subjective situations in the individual. So this is being contrasted with Jesus's first reaction, right? So when he first reacts, it is he bows down, he lowers himself, bending over in embarrassment, writing on the ground, okay? So the earth is this substance from which we are made. We are not divine beings. So this whole thing is all symbolic and is showing you that the Pharisees and Sadducees throw her to the ground. Jesus lowers himself to the ground, tending to that matter. He says nothing to them. So when they say, we are supposed to stone her, what do you say? When he's dealing with the personal and subjective issue of this woman, he says nothing to them because he knows they don't care. He knows it's irrelevant to them. That's not what they are talking about. And in order to encounter this woman in her sin and her shame and her humiliation, he acts out in his own body a participation in that humiliation and embarrassment by lowering himself, putting his hands to the ground where she is with her hands on the ground. And then in silence and in solidarity with her, participates in her humiliation and objectification by the Pharisees and Sadducees. Do you follow that? Not her objectification by the man with whom she was having adultery, not her own objectification of the man with whom she was having adultery, because he's not even there, but the objectification of her by the Pharisees and Sadducees, who care not only nothing about her, by which they've ended up making her an object of what they do care about, but they don't even care about the morals or the laws or the prerogatives of God that they're ascribing to Moses, which is Jesus. So he is participating and encountering her because they're both being objectified. They don't care about the word of God or truth or morals or the sexual immorality. And they don't care about her, the human being. So Jesus stoops, he lowers himself, he encounters that, says nothing to them because they are not relevant, and he knows that the issues that they've raised and the person that they brought to do it are also not relevant to what they care about. So now what he's doing is he lifts himself up. Okay? Image of the resurrection, by the way. Lifts himself up like they lifted up the serpent in the desert, the bronze serpent. Lifts himself up, and then he speaks. And what he says to them is, he that is without sin among you, which is not really an expression that primarily means has never committed a sin, but more like who doesn't sin would be more like the meaning that we would ascribe to those words is not what those words would mean to the Greek reading it. For them, they would understand those words to be a broader application of someone who does not possess sin. Okay? So like in English, we will say, I'm Nick. Like, I am Nick. Who was it? Oh, that was Nick. But in other languages, even Latin-based languages, their verbs to be, they have two. Spanish does, where one of them is like to be in a substantial makeup, like I am a human being, or to possess, like I am hungry, right? So in Spanish, they would say, I have hunger, like I possess the state or quality of being hungry, a state of being. And they would say, I call myself Nick, with the verb llamar versus tener, I think would be in a participle tengar. But anyway, I'm not a Spanish speaker. I'm just literally going off like high school conjugation of verbs and whatever I could remember. But that's the concept. So when Jesus uses the expression that in English is translated, he that is without sin, is being the verb to be, it broadly applies to is not possessed of sin, not possessed by sin, not in the process of committing or doing sin, but also who doesn't or can't sin because you're not possessed of it. It's not part of your substance, so you can't even do it. So there's only one who has such a state of being, and that is God himself. Jesus being the incarnation of God. So when says, let he that is without sin among you, let him cast a stone at her, he's not saying, okay, I agree, but here's a new rule. The first stone needs to be thrown by a person who is like righteous and has no sin. And the other reason we know he's not saying that is because he realizes they don't care about that. They don't care about the sin. They don't care about her. They don't care about the fact that she committed this sin. And they, in some senses, might not even believe that it's a sin. The Pharisees may be more inclined to believe that it's a sin, but the Sadducees would probably have a much more nuanced perspective of that. They believe that there's a vagueness in the precepts of God. They only believe in the first 5 books, whereas there's a more literalist and rigorous type of belief and practice on the side of the Pharisees. So they don't even agree over this issue. And they're not just doing this to Jesus, they're also doing it to each other. So this scene, you have to understand, is a political scene. It is 100% a political scene. It's not a moral scene. It's not an ethical scene. It's not a class on sexual ethics. It's not a class on forgiveness. It's not a theological scene. It's not about the question of mercy. The scene is politics and political and nothing other than politics. That's the scene. But the people who concocted this scene, the Pharisees and Sadducees, are not God. Jesus is God. So what he does is divinizes everything that takes place within God, in whom all of us have our being and existence, right? Catholic understands that. Philosophical understanding is like, oh, in order for us to exist, God has to continue to will perpetually our existence. It's not like he creates us, sets us in motion, we're off on our own, and then he would have to make some proactive decision to annihilate us. He's not Thanos, okay? It's way more power than that. You can't even exist except for in the mind of God as an active and living thing. So the act is wrapped up in our existence, not our annihilation. So he is constantly willing our existence for us to persist in such a way. So he's just taking hold of this scene that they created it of their own volition, of their own free will, and with their own prerogatives. And he's now touching it, right? Touching the earth with true, ineffable, incomprehensible, inscrutable divine power and wisdom. And for that reason, when he lifts himself up and addresses them and says, here's what I have to say about it, whoever is without sin, throw a stone. Since he has already refused to talk to them about the moral issue, he's already refused to talk to them about her. We know he's not talking about her. He's not talking about the act of adultery. He is not talking about the stoning as from the law of Moses. He's talking about what they are talking about. And that's your key. So what are they talking about? Well, we already know when the Pharisees and the Sadducees take Jesus to Pontius Pilate and they say, crucify him, he's like, for what? And they're like, blasphemy. And he's like, that's not my problem. That's your problem. I don't believe in that. And then they say, we can't kill anybody. That's the key. The Jewish hierarchy and infrastructure that existed within the Roman Empire and operated in the context of Roman rule did not have the power to impose capital punishment. That's why they had to bring Jesus to Pilate. There are also other reasons why they did do it, but the reason they had to do it was because they didn't even have the authority to impose a capital punishment. So, what would have happened if they did? Well, if you break the law in Rome, then you will pay the price for having broken that law. So now you understand what it means when it says, and this they said, tempting him that they might accuse him. Accuse him of what? accuse him of exactly what they eventually got him crucified for, which is being a revolutionary and an enemy of the state. Okay? So Jesus is ultimately crucified for being an enemy of the state. That was the argument that the Jews brought, and that's how they prevailed, with that argument and nothing else. Pilate made his decision when he said, no, I don't find any guilt in him, we're done. And then they said, if you don't, we're going to tell Caesar. We're going to tell Caesar that this dude says that he's the king. Sedition. And you let him go. At which point, then Pilate gives in, like a typical politician would do. Okay, so nothing new under the sun. A tale as old as time. So now, getting back into this story, so what's Jesus saying to them? What stone is he talking about? He's throwing a stone at who? What the Pharisees and the Sadducees are there doing is they're going to Jesus and saying, you think you're better than us. You talk like you're better than us. You moralize like as if you're better than us. But we all know that this isn't about morals or religion or sin or anything. This is about power. The Messiah is a king who is going to murder and destroy our enemies. And that's what we want to be a part of, and that's what we know we're doing. So they're viewing him as a sense of the way they understand themselves and their own motivations. And they're basically accusing him of like taking cheap shots, just like politicians do today, right? What does the left say? Oh, Trump is a pedo protector. What did Marco Rubio say? Oh, Tim Walz protected a pedo. Not me, though. I deported the pedo. To which a reasonable person responds like, oh, okay, so like that's the punishment for sex assault on a child is deportation? The dude was literally better off being deported than prosecuted here. It's like, well, it couldn't get prosecuted here. Why? Well, because Tim Walz pardoned him. You can conclude none of them cares about pedophilia. To the extent that it's bad in their minds anyway. I'm sure a lot of them care about it in the form of like the same way they care about good food. You know, they like to be able to do it, but obviously none of them cares from the perspective of the law. They have no interest, no motivation, no will to actually try to put a stop to it. Like, they don't care at best. Otherwise, they actually participate in it. So Rubio doesn't care. Walz doesn't care. Trump doesn't care. The Democrats don't care. None of them cares. And in this case, it's the same. They're looking at Jesus and they're saying, look, none of us actually cares about this stuff, but the people do. So I'm here to show you to the people as like weak. So really, you're so much better than us. Let's see you break the Roman law. Okay? That's what it's really about. You're accusing us of not really being, the Jews the way that we're supposed to be, but we are hampered and we are limited. You accuse us of just being after money and power and praise, but that's part of our campaign to retake political power. That like you accuse us of not being merciful and blah, blah, blah. And you've got your, and that we shouldn't care about money and you're going around poor and your campaign's being financed by, primarily women, like the Groypets, which I say jokingly, but literally like it was the women who were financing primarily Jesus' campaign. I think he had one super rich friend, that was Lazarus. And after he raised him from the dead, all the Pharisees wanted to kill him. So like even they understood like this is where this guy's money is coming from. That's why Judas hated Mary Magdalene, not because of like her sins, but because she broke a super expensive jar of alabaster oil that he couldn't afford. And so he was envious of her, and he was ambitious, and he was a thief. So this theme is there everywhere. You don't have to look too hard. You just have to kind of look and actually care. But so when Jesus says to them, let he who, has no sin, is not possessed of sin, is not a sinner, can't sin, and so on and so forth, throw the first stone, he's saying to them, that, and they way over their heads, they don't get it. But what he's really communicating is, you don't have the power to take down the Roman Empire. That's the problem. You don't have the power to do it. And So it's not merely like, I'm not just criticizing and condemning the fact that you LARP these morals when you don't really care about them at all. You're LARPing these morals with the justification that it's what needs to be done in order to win, and you can't win. And it baked into this single statement, let he who is without sin, is even giving them the reason you will never win. Because you are not sinless. You are not God. The whole structure, the devil is the prince of this world because Adam and Eve handed over the authority of the world to him in the garden. Okay, so like, that's what he's saying. You're not just a bunch of LARPers. You are giving away your actual birthright for nothing. You can't win. You won't win. You will never win. This temple is coming down, and it did. Going on, he says, and again, stooping down, he wrote on the ground. So after addressing them, he returns to the subjective and the personal. So the ruling class, the lawyers, the politicians, the presidents, the senators, they don't care about human beings. They don't care about people. They don't care about morals. They care about nothing but themselves. Never have, never will. That's how it was back then. That's how it is today. That's how it's been throughout the ages. That's how it's been before these ages. It always has been, always will be, because in the same way that humanity lacks the power to overcome a satanic superstructure in the world itself, the world's order and governance, even on an individual personal level, we lack the ability to overcome that satanic microstructure, which is our original sin, our inclination towards sin, and our complete and abject dependency upon God to get out of it. So they start with this bullshit story. Jesus ignores them, focuses on what they're pretending to care about by lowering himself to the ground, writing on it, inscribing his word into the earth itself from which humans were made, inscribing his word into the clay from which humans were made, which is also metaphorical because he himself is the Logos. He is the Word of God, become flesh and dwelt among us. He has taken up his human nature from that very same clay. So the Father inscribed his name in the earth when he incarnated the Son. Okay? If you follow, good for you. If you don't, read, study, and pray. You'll never succeed in the world of politics if you don't. The idea of this, oh, you can't mix religion and politics, you can't unmix them. They're inseparable. Weak religion is weak politics, or a LARPer. So now he returns to the ground because he actually cares about her. First and foremost, Jesus is preoccupied with the individual, the personal, and the subjective. That's why he took on a human nature. He did not take on a human nature and enter into the world in order to topple the Luciferian superstructure that the devil earned by virtue of duping Adam and Eve. He doesn't need to do that. He could do that from heaven. He could do that from himself. He doesn't need to come in and build up a human force in order to topple a human institution. He could just Lindsey Graham that dude in like a second. If the Russians can do it, trust me, God could do it. Maybe that's not funny. To me, it's funny. I thought that was super clever. I'm actually glad I didn't do this show yesterday because I wouldn't have had that joke at the ready. So sometimes you're your own best fan. So anyway, moving on, he says, again, stooping down, he wrote on the ground, but they, hearing this, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest. And Jesus alone remained, and the woman standing in the midst. Jesus then lifts himself up again, this time because he actually has the authority to do what he's about to do, because it's a divine authority and his divine prerogative. And he says, has any of them accused you? No, nobody's condemned you. No, okay. Neither do I. I'm not condemning you. Don't do this anymore. Stop it. Don't do it anymore. Okay? So that is the story. So now the meaning, the ultimate meaning. When he says, let he who has no sin throw the first stone. Remember, that's the only thing he said to the Pharisees. And they don't care about her, and they don't care about the morals, they don't care about the Mosaic law, they don't care about adultery. They care about political power and this pipe dream they have of toppling the Roman Empire and reestablishing the political primacy of the temple in the world. Getting back to Solomon, the same thing that they're doing today. That's why you hear talk about rebuilding the temple, okay? It's a religious thing, and that's why there are so many Jews who are atheists, because the atheists don't really believe in like this afterlife. They don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They do believe in a form of God, but they believe that they themselves are God as a collective. So what Jesus is actually responding to them that completely goes over their head is that he is the stone, and he is the stone that will be thrown at the political megastructures that the devil has built up since the fall. And that he is going to topple it, but that he is the one who's going to need to do it. And he's not only going to be the one to throw the stone, he is the stone, which is why later it's said in the New Testament, quoting the Old Testament, that the stone that the builders rejected has become the headstone or the cornerstone, the foundational stone upon which the builders will actually build the kingdom of God on earth. So he's the stone that is going to be thrown at the devil's power that he earned, and he's going to do that because the devil's power was in the law. So the law of sin is death, right? For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, right? All have sinned. That means no one can topple the devil's power except for the sinless one. So now you understand why Jesus concealed his identity from the devil. If you watched Mel Gibson's The Passion, you see that demonstrated in that art where the devil is saying to him, "Who are you?" Right? Because the devil does not actually realize this is God. He's convinced the whole time that through suffering and torture and humiliation and injustice, he can get this man, Jesus, to undermine God by sinning. And like every other drug addict or rapist or murderer or serial killer, anybody where the impulse is just so powerful they cannot resist themselves in spite of themselves, even to their own peril, that is exactly what the devil did when he killed Jesus. Couldn't stop himself. Could not overcome the foolishness that led him to believe if we just keep torturing him some more, he will denounce God and he will sin and he will be mine. But the moment that the power that the devil had, which is the law, was broken by the devil himself, it's like you executed an innocent victim. You used your influence in humanity and the structures that you built, and you broke the law from which all of your power is derived. That was the stone, and that toppled the empire. And everything from that point to the present day has been this ongoing battle of the church through which God is trying to build the kingdom of heaven here on earth, and the devil's forces incapable of accepting their loss and pressing forward anyway as if they could win. But the devil has never had it better than he had it before Jesus came. Which is why the church will always be his primary target, which is why the promise was given to Peter that the gates of hell will never prevail against it. So, in keeping with my pattern and commitment, vehement commitment to do a 30-minute show, I've now done an hour, and I think even longer than any other show that I've done. So I'll just have to assume that it was meant to be, and we can get into the rest later, but if you understand the story about the woman caught in the act of adultery, then you understand politics today. And if you understand politics today, then you can actually get to the stage of, well, then what can we really do about it? And that goes back to, right now, the real figurehead in Nick Fuentes, which is whatever it is that we can or must or might eventually do to prevail, it is not going to be by falling in line with either of these two political parties as they exist today. The whole thing is a joke. Both sides are a joke. They have no beliefs. It's the Sadducees on one side, the Pharisees on the other side. They hate each other the same way that the Pharisees and Sadducees hated each other 2,000 years ago. The Democrats and the Republicans hate each other today. They shamelessly attack and deride each other. They shamelessly make the substance of their attacks the substance of their hypocrisy, and are utterly unconcerned about that fact because the people are generally too stupid to realize it. And just like the Pharisees and Sadducees of 2,000 years ago, you can rely on the axiom, sort of, that anything that Democrats and Republicans agree on today is almost certainly bad. And any one that both Republican and Democrat alike hate is a figure of and a forerunner of and a potential participant in the monarch and the kingdom that he would be establishing on earth. And anybody who recognizes what authenticity looks like is going to be a figure of, a forerunner of, and a participant in the angelic pontiff who will ratify the authenticity and the sincerity and the goodness of the great monarch that we're looking for. So that's a show for an afternoon going into the early evening. I might try to do another show today, later on tonight, once I've had a little bit more rest because I missed yesterday. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for watching. Thank you for the people that have been subscribing. Every single individual I'm appreciative of, and it is exactly what I'm looking for in order to make sure that I'm not just wasting my time. So although I haven't thought of this yet, it just popped into my head right now. Geniusly at the very end of a super long show that almost no one would get to, but maybe that's just perfect, is if you do find value in what it is that you're learning here and seeing here, subscribe, like, follow me, and let's keep doing it. Peace out.